Welcome to the webinar entitled Break Down the SAT One Tip at a Time, presented by GradeSlam and Winward Academy. My name is Dr. Jennifer Winward, and I'm the founder and CEO of Winward Academy. We are so thrilled to partner with GradeSlam to provide additional resources and insider tips to high schoolers preparing for the SAT. I've been helping students prep for college applications and tests like the SAT and ACT for the past 20 years. So what we've put together here is a total overview of all of the expert tips that you'll need to maximize your potential on the test. Now, these tips will be incredibly helpful if you're taking the SAT this weekend, if you're in the middle of studying now to take the SAT in June or perhaps next fall, or if you're just starting to think about preparing and you just want an overview about the SAT. Now I'm going to start by giving you general tips about the test. Then we'll break down each section of the exam. So we'll talk about the reading and the writing and language sections, which together combine to give you one score from 200 to 800. That's called the evidence-based reading and writing score. Then we'll go through some general information about the math. I'll break down the no calculator section and the calculator section, which just like the reading and writing and language, combine, right? Those two math sections combine to give you one math score on a scale of 200 to 800. So the overall test is going to be between 400 and 1600 points. Again, reading and writing and language combine to give you that one score on evidence-based reading and writing. The math no calculator and math calculator combine to give you your math score. So we're going to go through each section. I'm going to give you an overview of what's tested, how many questions there are, how much time you have. I'm going to give you some beautiful pie chart breakdowns of all of the question types that come up, and then also give you some tips and some example questions for each one. Then at the end, I'm going to give you some I'm going to give you a test day checklist so that you'll know exactly what you need to bring with you to be prepared for test day. So let's start with those general tips. Number one, never, ever, ever leave a question blank in your Scantron. There is no penalty for guessing on the SAT. Just as an aside, there's also not a penalty for guessing on the ACT. So regardless of which test you're taking, if you run out of time or if you don't know the answer, you should always guess. Never leave a question blank. Number two, when you do guess, you should always guess the same letter. Now, statistically, you have a better shot of getting some of those questions right if when you guess you put A or B, right? You want to resist the temptation that a lot of students have to sometimes make patterns or zigzags with their Scantron bubbles. Don't do that, okay? Statistically, you're going to have a better shot of getting some of those right when you guess if you always guess the same letter. General tip number three, write all over the booklet, okay? It's yours. That means I want you to circle things. I want you to underline. I want you to take notes and draw out figures and diagrams on math questions. Write all over the booklet. Sometimes students arrive, they're confused, they don't know if they're allowed to write in it. You absolutely are, and I encourage that because it'll help you stay organized. It'll help you better engage with the material when you're kind of taking notes, jotting things down as you go. The fourth kind of big picture general tip is that when you are practicing SAT tests, always practice with a Scantron. You have to practice bubbling. I know that it sounds silly, but number one, bubbling that Scantron sheet takes time. So if you're doing a time practice section and you're only circling in the booklet and you're not also bubbling your Scantron, then it's not going to be an accurate reflection of what you're going to have to do on test day. Always bubble the Scantron as you go, number one, so you can practice the timing. And number two, I can't even tell you how many times I've had a student say, oh my gosh, I bubbled C and I meant to bubble B, right? It's possible to make mistakes when you bubble. You've got to practice it so that, again, when you're in those situations before the real test day, when you're practicing at home or at school or in the library, however you're kind of structuring your preparation, when you do time practice, always bubble with a Scantron as you go. It's going to give you a much more authentic practice experience. All right, before we dive into the specifics of the SAT sections, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder that if you're interested in more free tips, more amazing resources, then please subscribe to our YouTube channels so you can always stay up to date with the most recent tips and help that we're providing to students. One other thing, for those of you who are participating live in this webinar, remember you can post questions at any time. If you're watching the recorded version of this webinar that's just playing later, either on the GradeSlam YouTube channel or the Winward Academy YouTube channel, then please feel free to leave comments if you have questions. But again, if you're joining us live, please feel free to ask questions anytime in the chat window. All right, so now let's dive into those specific tips on each section. So we're going to start with the SAT reading section because that's the section that you'll have first. The SAT reading section has 5 passages. So 3 of the passages will have 10 questions. 2 of the passages will have 11 questions. So when you add that all up, you get 52 questions, and you have 65 minutes total for those 52 questions. One tip that I like to give to my students is a little time check for them. So because there are 5 passages total, after you've finished 3 passages, when you check the time, you should have about 25 to 26 minutes left. All right, so let's go over the different types of passages that you'll see. So the first passage is a single passage. So the entire text, right, of what you're reading is just one block of text. That's why it's called a single passage, because there's only one. The second type of passage that you can see in the SAT reading section is the dual passage. So that would mean that there's passage A and passage B. So each passage is going to be shorter, right? So the total amount of reading that you're going to do is the same. It's just instead of having one longer passage, you have 2 shorter passages. And in this dual passage kind of format, those 2 passages are going to be about a similar topic. So a lot of the questions that you'll see in the dual passage section will be asking you to compare the first passage to the second passage. How are they the same? How are they different? Etc. Now the third type of passage is called single passage with figures. So it's similar to the first type, right? It's a single passage, but then at the end there might be a figure or a table that's attached or that goes with that single passage. So the questions that you would see would not only ask about the text, like what you read, they would also ask about these figures or these tables that are provided to you. Now, make sure that as you're studying for the SAT reading section that you review specific strategies to maximize your success for each passage type, right? We have different strategies for how we approach each of these passages. So make sure that as you're studying that you're reviewing those strategies as you go. Okay, now that you know the different types of passages, let's now explore the specific types of questions that you will see. Now we're going to start with the question type that comes up the most frequently on the SAT reading section. So 23%, nearly a quarter of the questions, will ask you about specific content from the passage. So what does that look like? So here's an example question. The authors indicate that people value gift giving because they feel it what? So somewhere in the passage, there were a few sentences, right, or there's a section that talks about why people value giving gifts. So your job when you see a question like this, right, that's asking specific content from the passage, they're not telling you a line where to find it. They're not telling you a paragraph where to find it. So when you see these types of questions, you have to remember, oh yeah, it was over here in this section that the author talked about why people value giving gifts. So you're going to have to look at the questions and remember where in the passage they were discussed, so then it's easy for you to go back and reread the passage to be able to answer these types of questions that again are asking you about that specific content from the passage. But they're not making it easy for you because they're not giving you a line and they're not telling you where it is. What's challenging here is that you have to remember where in the passage this content was discussed. Next, we'll talk about line reference questions. So line reference questions, by the way, come up 18% of the time, right? Almost 1 out of every 5 questions is going to be about line references. One quick note too, this 18% frequency is the same on the ACT. One thing that's different on the ACT with that first category we talked about, the specific content from the passage, there are more questions like that on the ACT than there are on the SAT. Okay, so line reference questions. So line reference question looks like this one, right, number 16, where they give you the lines, right? So they make it a little bit easier for you because they're directing you where to look in the passage. But I want to make sure that you know that just because they give you those lines doesn't mean that you only have to read lines 41 through 44. So to answer these line reference questions correctly, you're going to need to read a little bit before and a little bit after those lines they give you, just so that you have the full context of the question. Next is a question type that is specific to the SAT. So the ACT does not have questions like this. And it's interesting actually because if you kind of add together on the SAT the specific content from the passage and the picking evidence to justify prior answers, those two combined are basically how much on the ACT they ask you about specific content from the passage. So what's interesting here about the SAT, and I really want to stress these questions because they're very challenging for students. This tends to be the section or the question type that most students struggle with. Again, it is unique to the SAT, but 18% of the time, so again, almost 1 out of every 5 questions is going to ask you which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question. So when you look at this example with number 14, right, I answered 13, and then question 14 kind of builds on question 13, where now I have to kind of justify why I picked the answer I did for 13. So if you think about it, these questions, right, picking evidence to justify a prior answer. Out of the 52 total questions on the SAT reading section, you're going to see questions like this about 10 times. So getting these questions right is going to give you about 50 to 60 points in your overall evidence-based reading and writing score. So just this one question type represents 50 to 60 points. Now, this is something that is stressful for students because they kind of feel like there's this double whammy, right? If you get 13 wrong, you're probably going to get 14 wrong as well, right? Because chances are you didn't look in the right place to answer 13 if you can't justify your answer with the proper evidence. So just a quick pointer, these questions are unique to the SAT. They are more challenging questions. So if you're preparing for the SAT test or as you're preparing, really zone in on these questions because again, 50 to 60 points, that's a lot, right? So we want to make sure that you're very comfortable with this question type. Next, vocabulary in context types of questions. So what do these questions look like? Basically, they'll give you a line reference and then they ask you in the context of that line, what does a word mean? So vocabulary in context basically just means, again, in line 10, what does the word ambivalent most nearly mean? So your job is to go to line 10, read the sentence, and then in the context of the sentence, figure out what that word ambivalent means. By the way, these vocabulary and context questions also occur on the ACT, but less frequently. So the SAT does tend to test vocabulary and context more often than the ACT. Okay, the next question type, these are also unique to the SAT reading section. So the SAT reading section will also have questions, about 11% of questions that ask you to find details from a figure, a table, or a diagram. So remember when I first told you about the passage types, I said there were single passage, dual passage, and then single with figures or tables. Right, so 11% of the questions are coming from this type of question, finding details from those figures and tables and diagrams. Just as a quick aside, same skill, right? This skill of finding details from a figure, table, or diagram, it's also tested on the ACT, but it's tested only in the ACT science section. So on the SAT, you'll notice that in the reading section, you're kind of asked to do this skill, which you are also asked to do on the ACT. It's just that on the ACT, it's not in the reading section, it's in the science section. Now, reflecting 11% of the questions, that's going to give you about 30 to 40 points overall in your score just from this question type. So again, whether you're preparing for the SAT only, SAT and ACT, regardless, you're going to have to zone in on this question type. So what happens, right, is we've given you a question, but there's some sort of figure, table, diagram that goes with that question. So having this skill, this ability to look at a figure, look at a table, look at a diagram, understand the key, know how to read the x-axis, the y-axis, to look for patterns, to read the information given to you, critical skill, right? Not just for the SAT and ACT, but also for life, right? Because just throughout your life, you're going to be presented with this type of information where you have to extract key information from figures and tables. Okay, now that we reviewed some of the most frequently tested questions, I want to now go over the top 3 tips for the SAT reading section with example questions for each. So what is tip number 1? This tip is really important. So it's that you don't have to answer the first question first. So what does that mean? So I took this little snip here for you, right, that shows that the passage ends at line 83, right? So it labels line 80, but then we have line 81, 82, 83. So I'm showing you here from this snip, this is the end of the passage. So the first question that's being asked after I've finished reading is question 32, and it says the main purpose of the passage is to what? Now, just because the first question that's being asked about this passage is this one, number 32, it doesn't mean that you have to answer it first. You can answer 33, 34, 35, 36, etc. Answer those other questions that are about specific parts of the passage first. In the course of answering those other questions that are about specifics, you're going to then be in a better position to answer question 32, which is about the main point of the passage. Now, if you skip 32 to come back to it, because you don't want to answer it first and you want to kind of dig into the passage and answer some more specific questions before you answer this kind of big picture general question, then that's amazing, but just don't forget, right? So make sure that you circle 32, put a giant star, like do something there so that you don't forget to go back. But again, you don't have to answer the questions in order that they're presented to you. And the sneakiest way that College Board, right, who makes the SAT, the sneakiest way that they trick students is they put these kind of big picture questions first, but you don't have to answer them first. Feel free to skip them and come back after you've answered more questions on specifics. Okay, big tip number 2. We talked about this already a little bit earlier. You have to be extra careful with the, quote, pick evidence questions, right? So here's question 9 and 10. Question 9 is asking you a line reference question, and then what happens in question 10? Now you have to justify your answer. So again, these are the most challenging, I would say. Definitely students tend to struggle the most with these types of questions. But remember that in general, throughout the test, you should always be able to find a specific line to justify your answers because everything is given to you in the text. So even though these questions are challenging because you're kind of going back, you're reading a lot, you're checking, you're trying to figure out how do I justify my answer? Yes, they're more challenging, so just be extra careful and make sure that you really practice these questions. Okay, tip number 3, you always want to answer the dual passage questions one passage at a time. So what do I mean by that? So I've just taken a small snip here, right? This obviously is not the full text of these passages, but we have a dual passage setup where we have passage 1 and passage 2. So it says that questions 42 to 52 are based on these passages. Now what's important for you to know is that questions 42 to 46 are only about passage 1. Questions 47 and 48 are about passage 2, and then questions 49 through 52 are asking questions comparing them. So what's the relationship between them? How would the author of passage 1 respond to the author of passage 2? What is something that passage 1 says explicitly, where maybe passage 2 says something implicitly? Those are the types of questions that you'll see kind of at the end. Now, how do we answer them? The most common mistake students make is they read everything first. They read the intro, they read passage 1, they read passage 2, then they start the questions. Don't approach the dual passage in that way. You should read passage 1, then answer the questions that are only about passage 1. So you'd read passage 1, answer questions 42 to 46. Then read passage 2, answer the questions only about passage 2, which are 47 and 48. Then answer the questions at the end that ask you to compare. Why do you want to do it in this way? Because it just helps you keep the information organized in your head, right? If you read both passages back to back and then try to answer questions just about passage 1, don't do that to yourself, right? You're just making it unnecessarily harder. So major tip with these dual passage questions, answer them one passage at a time. Now, at this point, we've reviewed the reading, right? Just a quick aside, if you take the reading with regular time, again, you have 65 minutes. After you finish the 65-minute reading section, you get a 10-minute break before writing and language starts. If you are taking the reading section with 1.5 extended time, which is the most common accommodation given to students who need accommodations on the exam, they get 98 minutes, but it's divided into 2 49-minute chunks with a 5-minute break in the middle. So if you have regular time, when you finish reading, you get a 10-minute break. If you have extended time, when you finish reading, you get a 5-minute break. Now, what comes after reading? Writing and language. Well, I guess technically what comes after reading is the break, but then after the break is writing and language. So let's explore the writing and language section now. Now this section has 4 passages with 11 questions each, so that gives us 44 questions in 35 minutes. What are the different passage types? First, you'll have text only. So remember, writing and language, this section is all about testing your English skills. So again, of course, we're going to look at the full pie chart breakdown just like we did for reading. Just to give you a quick overview before, remember English skills, these will be things like rules with punctuation, it's versus it's, your versus your, two versus two, right? These types of English skills. So when you see a passage, right, where you're revising part of the passage, you will either see a passage that has only text, or it could have text plus give you figures and tables. So remember, we talked about this in the SAT reading section. You could have a single passage, a dual passage, or you could have a single passage with figures and tables. It's the same exact thing with the SAT writing and language section. You could have just text, or you can have text where they've also given you figures and tables. Now, the questions that follow a passage type of text plus figures and tables could ask you just about the figures and tables themselves or about how they relate to the passage. Just as a quick aside, I know I kind of keep repeating this, but it's just really critical for you to know. Remember, on the ACT takes this ability to interpret figures and tables and puts it in a separate section only, and it's the science section. They call it the science section. You don't actually need to know bio or physics or chem to do well. You have to know how to read and how to interpret figures and tables, right? So that skill of reading critically, interpreting figures and tables is isolated to the science section of the ACT, whereas the SAT wants to test that skill on the reading section, the writing and language, and in the math section. So again, on the SAT, it's kind of peppered throughout, whereas the ACT really concentrates all those questions just into one section. All right, so let's start by reviewing what is the most frequently tested question type on the SAT writing and language section, and it's usage and mechanics. So what do we mean by usage and mechanics, right? Those are the types of questions that might ask you to revise a section if there's some sort of specific goal, asking you to move a sentence, delete a sentence, add a sentence. Now, out of the 44 total questions in this section, 15 to 16 of them are just going to be on this one topic of usage and mechanics. That breaks down to 100 to 120 points just in that combined evidence-based reading and writing score. That's huge, 100 to 120 points just if you can master usage and mechanics, right? That's precisely why on Winward Academy we have our students start with this lesson when they're studying for the SAT. You have to master it, right? Because it comes up so much and it's worth so many points. Next is punctuation. So punctuation questions, 18%, right? So again, almost 1 out of every 5 questions is going to test your knowledge of punctuation. That means that punctuation is worth 60 to 70 points, right? So you can see in this breakdown, just usage of mechanics and punctuation, just if you can master those 2 lessons, you have now mastered over half the questions on the SAT writing and language. Now, what are the punctuation questions going to be? They're going to test you on your knowledge of rules of commas, semicolons, colons, dashes. Again, as you are studying for the SAT exam, it's so critical that you know A, how frequently things are tested, and B, what is your personal accuracy in each of these sections so that you know exactly how to prioritize your studying and your review. Next, transitions. Transitions comprise about 10% of the questions on the SAT writing and language, worth about 30 to 40 points overall. Transition questions aren't hard per se, you just have to read super carefully, right? Because remember, a transition is a bridge. It's connecting information before with information after, so you have to read really carefully to make sure that you're forming the proper bridge. All right, so next I want to jump to figures and tables. So figures and tables, right, you've noticed we kind of keep talking about these a little bit as we go. 3% of the writing and language questions are figures and tables. Remember, again, this kind of English section testing you on figures and tables will only happen on the SAT. On the ACT, this skill is in the science section, and on the ACT, the English section, which is the equivalent of writing and language, it's just a different name, does not test you on this ability or this skill. Figures and tables on SAT writing and language going to be worth about 10 to 20 points overall. So nothing as crazy impactful as usage of mechanics, punctuation, transitions, but still worth a significant amount of points. Next, there are going to be some other tested concepts, right? Things like verbs, agreement, adjectives, adverbs, idioms, where you can see that they're, comprising a good percentage of the test. But what's important for you to take away really about all of these concepts, but really these ones I have circled here, right? These are just important concepts for you to know for your writing at school, for professional communication when you go to college or when you have a job, right? This isn't just about the SAT or the ACT. Now, quick note. If you are trying to improve your score by hundreds of points really quickly, you need to focus on those high impact lessons that are tested super frequently, right? So things like usage of mechanics, punctuation, transitions. If you're trying to get a score in the 700s or higher, then you basically have to also make sure that you've studied those nitty-gritty concepts that aren't tested as frequently, right? So the ones we have circled here, also the ones that are tested less frequently, basics but essentials, parallelism, pronouns, apostrophes, modifying phrases, all of those concepts, right? Again, if you are trying to score in the 700s, you need to master everything on this pie chart. If your score is starting a little bit lower than that, but you're just hoping to gain several hundred points quickly and easily, you're not going to want to prioritize apostrophes and modifying phrases, right? They don't come up enough. So when you are starting your studying, you want to start by really prioritizing those super high impact lessons and then kind of working your way around this pie chart so that you're really checking them off based on how frequently they're tested. Now, you hopefully have a good overall sense of what types of concepts come up on the SAT writing and language. So now I want to give you 3 big tips for this section, and then just as we did for the reading, give you some example questions for each. So what is the first big tip for SAT writing and language? So U and M, that stands for usage and mechanics. So the most frequently tested question on the SAT writing and language is a usage and mechanics question that asks you to follow a question. So what do I mean by following a question? What I mean is that you read a question and you need to do exactly what the question asks. The question says, which choice best completes the description of a self-reinforcing cycle? That means that the correct answer, there's only going to be one, is the only one that describes that this cycle reinforces itself. So usage and mechanics, these top tips, if you get a question that says which one does this, whatever this is, right? Which one is colorful? Guess what? The correct answer is the one that's colorful. If the question says which one emphasizes that the student is bored, the correct answer is going to be the only one that emphasizes the student is bored. You need to do exactly what the question asks. Now, for any of you GradeSlam students who are watching, if you're having trouble with any types of specific problems like this one, remember you can always go to GradeSlam for instant support. For all of you Winward Academy students out there, remember, as you're kind of going through this process of reviewing, you can do an analysis of your practice exams. You'll know exactly what concepts are weaker for you, and then you can access all those practice questions, review those step-by-step explanations anytime. So again, whoever is listening to this, right, our goal, GradeSlam and Winward Academy's goal is that we can just give you as much support as possible so that you can understand what is expected of you, how frequently do things come up, and that we can help you really prioritize your studying so that you're most efficient as possible with your time and that you also get a big return on your investment. All right, what is the next most frequent type of question? It's also from usage and mechanics. Shouldn't be surprising to you, right, since it's the most frequently tested concept. But the next type of question is when they ask you to move, delete, add a word, sentence, or paragraph, right? So you've got this word, sentence, or paragraph. They want you to move one, delete one, or add one. So let's look at an example, right? Here's an example asking you to add a sentence. So they give you this sentence, and then they ask you where should we put it. Now, really quickly, you need to read super carefully. Notice in the answer choices, some say before, some say after. You must read carefully. What is our third tip for the SAT writing and language section? It comes from punctuation. Should again make sense because it's the second most frequently tested concept. And I'm calling it choosing the right one. So what do I mean by that? I mean that you will be presented with questions that ask you to pick between different punctuation types. This example is asking you to choose between semicolons and colons. You could also have a question that asks you to pick among a period, semicolon, colon, and comma, right? Or no punctuation. So when I say choosing the right one, what I mean is that you're presented with multiple options for punctuation. Your ability to get this question right depends on your knowledge of when to use each punctuation type. So you've got to know the rules for when to use which one, and then you'll be in a great position to crush these questions with punctuation. All right, so now we've done some good review of the SAT writing and language. So what I want to do next is give you a general overview of the math section. And then what we'll do after that is give you some specific tips for the non-calculator and the calculator portion. So in the math, the SAT math section, again, there's a non-calculator and calculator section. So overall, when you put those two sections together, you will have a total of 58 questions, and you will have a total of 80 minutes to answer those questions. What are the question types? Now, the majority of questions in the math section are multiple choice, but you also have grid-in questions on the SAT math. Now, the ACT does not have any grid-in sections. They are all multiple choice. But on the SAT math, you have multiple choice and grid-in. So what grid-in means is that you basically have a question, but there are no options, right? You have to actually answer the question, solve it, and then you have to write in the answer in your test booklet. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check out those pie charts that break down the math section based on how frequently each concept comes up. So what is our most frequently tested question on the SAT math section? It's solving algebraic equations. So the types of questions that are included in this category would be things like f of x, linear systems word problems, combining units, solving multiple linear systems, quadratics, completing the square. Now with 46% of questions coming from just this one category, so mastering those math concepts will give you 200 to 300 points in the SAT math section. No joke how critical this section is. The next most frequently tested concept is geometry and graphing fundamentals. So the types of questions that would be in this category would be things like a coordinate plane, so understanding, right, the XY coordinate plane, graphing and solving lines. SAT loves asking questions about slope. What are the main graphs? So x squared, x cubed, absolute value of x, square root of x, knowing what those graphs look like and how they get transformed, up, down, left, or right. Distance formula, midpoint formula. Those types of questions, those geometry and graphing fundamentals questions, are worth 80 to 90 points in your SAT math score. After geometry and graphing fundamentals comes arithmetic fundamentals or arithmetic, right? So things like mean, median, and mode, probability, percents, ratios, those types of questions. After arithmetic fundamentals comes algebra fundamentals. So 8% of questions are on fundamental algebraic concepts. So things like key definitions, prime, even, least common multiple, greatest common factor, right? Just knowing what those definitions are. Knowing how to combine fractions, how to do FOIL, how to factor, what are rules for exponents and radicals when you want to add them or subtract them or multiply them or divide them, absolute value, inequalities, right? Those types of concepts are going to be those algebra fundamentals category. Now, what's also important for you to know about the SAT math section, which by the way, this applies to the non-calculator and the calculator portion, is that they give you these formulas. So all of these formulas that you see right now on the screen, they will all be provided to you in the SAT non-calculator section and the calculator section. Quick note, the ACT does not give any equations like this. So a lot of students get really excited like, ooh, I love the SAT math better because it gives me those basic equations. Now I want you to pause for a second because I don't want you to get too excited because yes, the SAT does give you these formulas, but then they ask harder questions that require the application of these formulas. So they might give you the formula for area of a circle, but then their question doesn't ask for area of a circle, it asks for area of a regular hexagon, which is made up of 6 equilateral triangles, where then there's a little bit more, right, to how to solve that question, where yes, it helps you to have that basic formula, but to get the questions right requires that you have a lot more knowledge. So again, yes, they give you these basic equations, but please don't assume that that means that the questions are going to be easy. Yes, it becomes easier for you that you have these questions provided, but to be honest, you should have all of these questions memorized, or not questions, excuse me, you should have all of these equations, all of these formulas memorized regardless, just because they come up constantly in math class. So yes, they're provided to you. I wanted you to see which ones are provided, but please, please put in an effort to have these memorized regardless so that then you'd be ready if you take the ACT, but also you'll just be much stronger in math class if you can have all these formulas, quick out of your brains. Another important note that I want to go over before we, move into the SAT non-calculator portion to give you that breakdown, and then we'll move into the SAT calculator portion to give you that breakdown, is I do want to just point out to you some super, super rare, super random concepts that can come up. So this means they might come up once on the whole test, maybe twice on the whole test. But these types of concepts can be things like matrices, synthetic division, exponential growth, understanding kind of statistical terms like standard deviation. So you don't actually have to calculate standard deviation, but just understanding theoretically what it is. So again, we're talking 1 to 2 total questions per test. Super rare and random. But even sometimes these kind of random things that you're learning in math class, they're not going to make a huge difference in your score unless you're aiming for that top score. So again, if you're starting and you're just trying to see some growth of a couple hundred points in your SAT score, what does it make sense for you to do? It makes sense for you to focus on those super high impact lessons, right? With solving algebraic equations. Let me actually go back really fast, right? Solving those algebraic equations, looking at geometry and graphing fundamentals, arithmetic fundamentals, right? Those high impact lessons. But I did just want to make sure that you also knew that you can see those super rare and random things. If you know how to solve them, obviously go for it. If you have no clue how to solve them, remember that's okay. It's to be expected that you will encounter things that you're going to feel like, how do I solve this? If that happens to you, just guess and move on. Remember, don't leave anything blank if you don't know how to solve it. Okay, so let's take a step back for a second. We finished writing and language. There is no break. So remember, when we went from reading to writing and language, we had a break. But from writing and language to the non-calculator math portion, there's no break. You go straight back to back. What does the SAT math section with no calculator look like? There are 20 questions total, and you have 25 minutes. Now, those 20 questions are divided into 15 multiple choice and 5 grid-in. So again, you have 25 minutes to answer 15 multiple choice questions and 5 grid-in questions. Now remember that pie chart, right? I gave you kind of the full breakdown of the entire math section. But that being said, there are some question types that are more common in the non-calculator math section, and there are some question types that are more common in the calculator math section. So since we're talking now about the non-calculator section, I want to do a quick call out, like what are the most frequently tested questions in the non-calculator SAT math? So they love asking you to do things like distribute, combining like terms. They like asking about complex numbers, FOIL, solving multiple linear systems, solving similar triangles using SOHCAHTOA, where again, the numbers aren't going to be crazy hard because you don't have a calculator, but with basic fundamentals, you would be expected to then be able to solve these types of questions without a calculator. So next, what I want to do is give you examples of the top 2 types of questions that are asked in the non-calculator SAT math section. So the top 2 questions asked, number 1, combining units. So here's an example of that type of question. So you'll see, the first thing I want to show you, right, this is a multiple choice format. So remember, the SAT math has 2 formats, multiple choice, grid-in. With these 2 questions that I'm giving you examples of, one is a multiple choice and one is a grid-in because I want you to be able to see both. So you'll notice this first, top question that's asked in the non-calculator math is expecting you to distribute that negative sign and then combine like terms to simplify. So that's the number 1 most frequently tested question type in the non-calculator math. What about number 2? The other most common question type in the non-calculator math has you solve multiple linear systems. Now notice here, right, this question is an example of a grid-in format. So there are no answer choices, right? There's no A, B, C, or D. Your job is to solve these 2 lines, figure out what is X, right? And then whatever value you get for X, you will actually write it into your booklet. So again, you're not choosing A, B, C, or D. You're actually producing an answer that you solve. Remember, 20 questions total in 25 minutes. 15 of them are the multiple choice, which is like the combining units example question I gave. 5 of them are grid-in, which is like this solving multiple linear systems example question. Now, after you finish the non-calculator math section, you get a 5-minute break. That applies to people with regular time and extended time. So during that 5-minute break, you'll have a minute, to stretch and grab your calculator, right? Because when you come back after that 5-minute break, it's time for the calculator portion, for the math portion with a calculator. Now, it's a longer section, right? This one's 55 minutes compared to 25 minutes. So make sure that you are being wise to use that break to recharge, right? Whatever you do, don't put your head down and think, oh, I'll just snooze for 5 minutes. That's the worst thing you could do. Don't turn your brain off. You want to get up, you want to move around, you want to keep the blood flowing. Do things that are going to wake yourself up, not shut yourself down. All right, so we've come back from our 5-minute break. We're ready to start the calculator math section. We've got 55 minutes to do 38 questions. Now, what is the breakdown of those questions? 30 of them are going to be multiple choice. 8 of them are going to be grid in. Remember, I told you when we first talked about the general math overview that the majority are multiple choice, so you can see that with both of these sections, right? Remember, the non-calculator math had 15 multiple choice and 5 grid in. This calculator math has 30 multiple choice and 8 grid in. Now, just as we talked about with the non-calculator math section, there are some concepts that are tested more frequently when you have a calculator on the math. So you should be expected to solve f of x, real life algebra questions, lines. So they love testing slope-intercept forms, slopes, word problems that require you to solve percents, and they also love testing you on converting units. So going from seconds to minutes to hours, going from inches to feet, those types of questions will come up frequently in the SAT math, but again, when you have a calculator, not when you don't have a calculator. So the next thing we're going to do is, again, go through those top 2 questions that you are asked in the calculator portion of the math. So the first most frequently tested question will be one about slope and slope-intercept form. So here is an example question, right? You'll notice that in this question, it's requiring that you understand what is the equation of a line, what is the meaning of the y-intercept, right? And of course, you also need to know the meaning of slope to be prepared for these types of questions. What is the number 2 kind of most frequently tested question in the calculator portion of the math? Real life word problems. So these kind of algebra problems where you are solving real life questions, but needing to create algebraic expressions or algebraic equations to solve. So you'll notice this example question 32, it's a grid-in format. Right, so they've given us some real life scenario. We have to create an algebraic equation to be able to solve for a missing variable. So we've done kind of this breakdown, SAT math no calculator, SAT math calculator. Now let's kind of think about what happens next. So let's say we've finished the math calculator section. So that's 55 minutes if we have regular time. It's 83 minutes if we have extended time. And by the way, if you have extended time, this calculator portion, you do get a break, a 5-minute break halfway at that halfway mark. So after you finish the math calculator, if you're not taking the optional essay, you're done. The test is now over. If you are taking the optional essay, then at this point you would move into that next section on the essay. Now, I want to say something really quickly about this whole idea of like the essay being optional. Now, most competitive universities do require an essay score. So it's going to be really important that you check with your counselor at school and that you check the college websites to make sure that if you are applying to colleges that require the writing section, right, they require the essay, then you have to make sure that when you register for the SAT or for the ACT, right, that you're also registering for the writing portion, that you're also registering for the essay. If you check with your counselors and you check with all the college websites and none of the colleges to which you're applying require the essay, then you don't need to take it, right? And after finishing this math portion with the calculator, you're done with the test. But again, if you're taking the optional essay, which most of you will be doing if you're applying to more competitive universities, then after this math section with the calculator, you would move on to the essay. Now, the essay on the SAT is 50 minutes if you have regular time or 75 minutes if you have extended time. Okay, so the last thing that I want to go over with you for this webinar is a master checklist, right? What should you bring with you on test day? So we're going to go through this list together. The items that are in the left column are absolutely required. The ones on the right column are my suggested things that you bring. So what do you absolutely have to bring with you or you won't even be able to take the test, right? You have to bring your photo ID. You have to bring your registration ticket. Obviously, you need to get to the site, so you're going to want to make sure that you have directions so you know exactly where to go. And you also want to make sure that you bring pencils, right? So you always want to have extras. Then just in case if a neighbor runs out, right, you can even help a neighbor, which is always nice. So please bring 3 or more number 2 pencils. I list calculator in the required column. Technically, if you showed up without a calculator, they would still let you take the test, but it would be a major struggle for you, right? So make sure that you are bringing a calculator and that it has fresh batteries, or bring extra batteries as a backup just in case your calculator dies, right? You never know, and it would just be the worst thing if that happened to you. So make sure that your calculator is fully charged or that you have backup batteries. Now, the second column, right, quote unquote, is optional, but I do want to point out why I recommend students bring each of these items. So number one, a watch without an audible alarm. If you have anything with you that beeps during the test, they will cancel your exam and take it away from you. So make sure that if you bring a watch that it's never going to beep. I recommend students bring watches because sometimes the clock in the room is behind you, or it's in an awkward position, or it's hard for you to track the time. So it's always nice when you can kind of just do that yourself. And again, without an audible alarm, because nothing can beep or your test will be canceled. Pencil sharpener, same kind of thing. You don't really know what's going to be in the room, so it's just nice to be able to take care of yourself just in case you need to sharpen a pencil. Eraser, a lot of students prefer having a separate eraser because sometimes the erasers on number 2 pencils just aren't as good as when you have that separate eraser. So if you're the type of person who likes having that kind of big extra eraser, make sure you bring it with you. Tissues, right? These tests are offered year-round. A lot of times during times of year when people can have sniffles and need to blow their nose, or they're sneezing, with allergies, or they're a little sick or something like that. So you'll just be a lot more comfortable if you have tissue, so that if you need to blow your nose, you can easily do that. Snacks, right? It's critically important that you are able to refuel during the day. That being said, the snacks that you bring should not just be something that's super sugary. You're going to want to think of snacks that you can bring that are going to give you good sustained energy. Actually, on Winward Academy's blog, we have tons of extra free resources where we can break down, this is what you should have for breakfast, this is what you can have for snacks. So if you ever want to check that out, please do. It's free, and we love making those types of tips and resources available to students. But just as a quick note for you, what are some good snacks to bring? You could bring, celery with peanut butter or almond butter, something like that. You could bring little muffins where you maybe put almond butter and honey on top of them. Sometimes people like to bring Chex Mix, or no, it's not called Chex Mix. What is it called? Where it has like nuts and, why is my brain eluding me right now? But anyway, the little snack mix where it has a bunch of nuts in it, like mixed nuts, can be really good to refuel. You don't want to overeat, so sometimes students will bring like half a sandwich or something like that because they don't want to necessarily get super full. They just want to kind of sustain some nice energy. Bottled water, definitely important that you're hydrated, but you also don't want to be too hydrated, right? So if during your first break you chug a liter of water, guess what's going to happen to you? If you don't have the opportunity to use the restroom, in between, and you're in the middle of a section and you really have to pee and it's very uncomfortable, you're going to be distracted. So drink water that's enough to just feel hydrated, not have a headache, but don't drink so much water that you're going to have a really, really intense urge to have to use the restroom. Last tip is just to make sure that you dress comfortably. Also make sure that you bring a sweatshirt or something as a backup just in case the room is cold, right? You're going to be arriving at a school or some sort of test site very early on a Saturday morning. Sometimes because it's a weekend, the schools aren't good at having the rooms heated or even cooled, right? Sometimes just air temperature is outside of your control. So again, you want to take anything that's outside your control and try to control it yourself. You want to have a watch so you don't have to rely on their clock. You want to have a pencil sharpener so you don't have to rely on their pencil sharpener. You want to have a comfortable outfit where you can easily get warmer or cooler depending on the temperature of the room. So again, you don't need to dress super fancy, right? You want to be really comfortable. You're going to be sitting for hours and hours and hours. So be comfortable and make sure that you bring a sweatshirt or something just in case the room is chilly. Okay, last thing that I want to say before we finish is please do not forget to answer every single question. Don't leave anything blank. Always guess the same letter. And on behalf of GradeSlam and Winward Academy, thank you again for attending this webinar. Once again, I'm Dr. Jennifer Winward with Winward Academy, and we wish you the best of luck on your upcoming SAT. Please stay tuned for more webinars with lots of insider tips and tricks to maximize your success and to prepare you for college and beyond. Thank you.